Please welcome writer Samuel D. Hunter.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for being here, Sam. When I introduced the film, I mentioned that it was originally a play which I'd seen, and I was struck watching the last sequence that, if I recall correctly, the ending of the original, it was stark and it went directly to black. And this is it's a subtle change, but it's so poignant, the change. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. And thank you everybody for having me. I'm really happy to be here. So the end of the play, the way that I scripted it is Ellie gives the last line of the essay and is cut off. So she says, "And it made me feel glad for my," and then the line is cut off, and then there's just a stage direction that says, "Charlie looks up, a sharp and take a breath, end of play." But I did also script in the sound of waves building throughout that final sequence. So there was always something kind of unreal about it. And the way that I always talked about it is I wanted the end to feel like an apotheosis. And Darren took that and really ran with that idea in a way that I think is really lovely and bold.
Mm-hmm. Which, you and I were talking outside that I remember seeing the play and then watching the movie again, that people take everything so literal, and the apartment itself and him marooned, pun intended, on that couch, they take it literal, but we're dealing with mythical themes and ideas, and Darren just pumps all of that up. Can you tell us about that idea?
Yeah, I mean, at this point, I've written quite a few plays. I've written, since The Whale, I've written 12 or 13 other plays, and I think they all present as realism, but I don't think they are totally realism. I'm actually really interested in the dichotomy between sort of putting people in very quotidian spaces, but kind of letting more divine elements or spiritual elements seep into it. Like the last play that I had in New York, last May, was called A Case for the Existence of God, and it was set in a cubicle, and the two guys never stood up until the very end. But like The Whale, it was chasing after some really huge ideas, and I've just always felt like, it's one thing to write a play called A Case for the Existence of God and set it in a church, but it's another thing entirely to write a play called A Case for the Existence of God and set it in a cubicle, and maybe you can find God more easily in the cubicle, strangely enough, because like you're searching for it. So yeah, I mean, I've always thought of this play and this film as sort of like, yes, it is set in this 2-bedroom apartment, which does, present very real, but I think like Maddie's lighting and
the production design,
beautiful production design, really like one of the unsung heroes of this play are those two production designers, Mark and Robert. Because it was so, I had the gift of being able to be on set the entire time and work with Darren and the actors, and so, I spent 3 months in that apartment, mm-hmm. and the level of detail and nuance was incredible.
And you always intended that apartment to be evoking the internal world of Charlie, right?
Yeah. I mean, very early on in our discussions with Darren, he saw the play. I had no intentions of making it into a movie. I just was desperately trying to be an off-Broadway playwright. And Darren saw the Playwrights Horizons in New York City, which is one of my favorite theaters. And so when they did this play, I kind of felt like my dreams are coming true. Like I'm having a successful off-Broadway run of a play that I wrote, and a play that's like very personal to me and connects to a lot of personal stories for me. So all that being said, when Darren and I started talking, I had no preconceptions about like what it could be as a film. And I also knew that, the more traditional approach would be to open it up, like we were talking just now about the August Osage County film.
Tracy Lett's play.
Yeah, Tracy Lett's play that got turned into a film, then they opened it up. And there was something about this play that I was like, well, I guess we could have flashbacks, we could see Ellie at school, we could see Liz at work, Mary at home, but every time I ideated about that, I was just like, this isn't working. Like this story, I mean, I think other plays of mine could be opened up if you wanted to make them into films, but this one really, like, it's about living with this person and being in his world and never leaving it. And without me even saying anything, Darren said in one of our early meetings, let's keep it in the apartment. And I was really glad that he said
But
that.
you had already attempted to open it up.
Not in writing, just sort of on paper. I was sort of like, is there a story of Ellie and a boy at school she likes who's being mean to her? But I mean, it's just all this stuff that felt like unnecessary, like just kind of like a Rube Goldberg machine of events and causality that had really nothing to do with what the story is.
And when the decision was made to keep it all in the apartment, was that something that you brought up to Darren, or he came on to his?
I've been thinking it, but I mean, you know, I've since done some screenwriting since that initial meeting with Darren, but at the time I had done none. I bought Final Draft screenwriting software to write this movie, So yeah, I mean, early on, I you know, when my instinct was to keep it in the apartment, I was like, is that my lack of imagination? Is this like me being a difficult playwright? You know, and I mean, you know, and especially it's Darren Aronofsky, and so I'm not going to be like, this is how you make a film, Mr. Aronofsky. So no, I hadn't said anything. So he arrived at it himself, and I was so glad that he did. I mean, it was really hard. You know, it was really, really hard. But, you know, that was 10 years ago that I first met Darren. So it's been 10 years of not constant conversation, but 10 years of conversations and drafts and, you know, imaginings.
One of the things I've loved about all of your work, your plays, and now The Whale as a movie is that there's so many themes and so many ideas, and you don't boil it down to one big idea and one thing. This is what the movie's about. I mean, anybody who watches The Whale, there's so many ideas flying at us. You know, can you tell us about navigating that complexity and not narrowing it down to one theme?
Yeah, it's always just been a taste level thing with me where, like, when I see a film or a play and I feel like it arrives at like a thesis statement, like, here's what you should think about this, I just get droopy because I'm like, you could have just told me. Like, you didn't need to spend 90 minutes illustrating this singular idea for me. Like, what I love about drama and all the like, kind of classic plays that I love, you know, you think about Shakespeare, there's no thesis statements in Shakespeare. You know, it's this wider field of understanding that you get to like, and that's what's amazing about the dramatic form, is that there's like no authorial voice. It's all of these different perspectives, and you get to just sort of live with these people and be in this very complex field of understanding. I mean, it you know, I think it asks for a kind of engagement that resists boiling down to like a single statement. I think it's also like, weirdly, it's a phenomenon that people ask for these thesis statements only from modern writing. Like, they're happy to engage with a Shakespeare play that is very complicated. They're happy to engage with a Miller play that's very complicated. But like, if it's new, they're like, well, what are you saying? And you know, like, I just have never.
And there's
like that.
Act 1, Act 2, Act 3, conflict and resolution, et cetera, which you tend to evade.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can look at this naturally in a 3-act structure. But like, it's funny, actually, early on, Darren sent me a book called The Writer's Journey, which is, it's all like the Joseph Campbell stuff for anybody, that's kind of inside baseball, but it's like basically a map for how to tell a story, and it's told in this very mythic language of like the first threshold and the helper or something. I don't remember all the things, but and Darren encouraged me to kind of like put the whale into that schematic, and like I started to do it, and it felt like I was going to have a panic attack because it was just like these characters can't breathe if I. It's almost like I was putting them in straitjackets, you know, like I have to approach this as like human beings in a room before I think about larger structural concerns.
So you mentioned you'd never written a screenplay before, and then you're sitting down to write this. Did you watch, you know, films? I mean, I kept thinking when I was watching this, and as a tribute to you, I kept thinking about Streetcar Named Desire, the film adaptation, and Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, that don't open it up, but is so cinematic.
Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf is one of my favorite movies, and that was a real. Albee is one of my favorite writers, even though we're very different writers. Yeah, I mean, I did watch some of those movies, and I read a few screenplays, but I also was like, I have this really rare opportunity here of this world-class director who can, he's one of the very few people on earth who can execute a movie like this,
yeah,
and get funding for a movie like this. So I don't want to lean into sort of any of the tropes or the mechanisms by which a larger movie that needs to make money, operates by.
Yeah, yeah.
And I really just was like, how does this want to live on film? How can I find a cinematic language for this story? How can some of this dialogue happen in silent scenes, Like, for instance, during the pandemic, I had the idea for the second bedroom. Because I thought, this can be like the sealed off archaeology of his relationship with Alan. And I think that those silent scenes of those second bedroom stuff, those really replace like a really big monologue that's in the play that Charlie gives to Thomas about Alan. Mm-hmm. So it was about that kind of thing. It was sort of like.
Also, one of the most emotional scenes in the movie, which were not in the play, is the pizza guy finally, getting to see Charlie. Tell us about how did you arrive into that scene?
That was like I think maybe in the first draft of the screenplay that was in there. Because I thought, okay, here's an opportunity to remind the audience that like we've been living with this guy for an hour and 20 minutes or hour 30 minutes, however long it's been. And we're learning to see him as a whole human being. Not that one should have to learn how to see somebody as a human being, but like hopefully any barriers that anyone might bring to a character like this have been broken down by that point, hopefully long before that point. But I wanted to remind the audience that the outside world still sees him in a certain way, even as they've gotten to know him. So yeah, that was one. But it was such an early thing that so right before we went into rehearsal and production, Darren went to the Lincoln Center Performing Arts Library, which is this great library in New York City where they record not all plays in New York, but a lot of them. And so you can just go and anybody can watch these, taped live performances. It's an amazing resource. And Darren hadn't seen it in 8 years or whatever it was, so he went into the library and watched the film stage production. And he called me and he was like, "Where's the pizza boy?" And I was like, "He wasn't in the stage." And he was like, and Darren was like, "Yeah, he was." And he told me like how it was staged and where he was, and I was like, "There was never a pizza boy in this play."
The scenes with the daughter, with Ellie, I've seen it a couple of times now, and I mentioned I saw the play. There's so much exposure. There's so raw emotion happening. Were those scenes difficult for you to write?
Yeah, I mean, in a weird way, I'm kind of glad that I wrote it when I wrote it 10 years ago, because I have a daughter now who's 5, and I think I would have had a really hard time writing those scenes now. But I really wanted to. I was like, look, if this is a guy who is really about faith in other people, is his sort of core principle. Like that, I wanted to place him in a world that kind of gave him every reason to not believe that, because I think that like faith in other people and optimism and a rejection of cynicism is hard work. It's not easy, Like you can deliver platitudes. Sure, but I think the harder work of being a non-cynical human being in 2022 is confronting this stuff, Like if you're a person like me and you don't really like have a core belief system that's neatly delivered to you by a set of religious principles or cultural values or a government, like you kind of live in a harder place, and I think when you live in that place, it's so easy to become cynical. And I think cynicism so easily masquerades as sophistication, it masquerades as intelligence, but actually I find it totally intellectually bankrupt and perversely comforting, I think. Like this whole attitude of like the world's ending, haha, clink. Like, and especially now as a dad, it's my job now to not be a cynical person because I cannot usher my kid into this deeply complicated world with a sense of doom. I just can't. So anyway, getting back to your question, like I wanted Ellie to be in that place. Like she says, she has made the decision that people are assholes. And so Charlie has a very high hill to climb, and I don't think he really climbs it until the final moments of the film.
The play was set in 2009, and you shift the timeline to 2016. Right. Can you tell us the logic behind it?
Yeah, it started in kind of a practical place of like, I started working on the play in 2009, and so like I just wrote it present day, but and it's funny, like back when I first started writing it, the idea of teaching online was a very new thing, which is now we all know what that is, and also like a sense of isolation, like that's also been turned way up. But anyway, getting back to your question, when we started talking about it, we were like, well, we don't want to set it present day. We filmed it in the dead center of the pandemic. And we don't want to set it during the pandemic because like Liz as a healthcare worker would be wearing masks. Like there would be discussion about, like it would be this like element that didn't seem to kind of work with the story very well. And also, like, setting it in 2009 made it kind of a weird period piece, like what kind of iPhones? You know what I mean? Like, it felt like, but I forget if it was Darren or or maybe we mutually arrived at this decision of 2016. And what I loved about it is that, it's set right around like Idaho Super Tuesday, what I love about it is that it really places the story of these 5 characters who are all on the precipice of something really huge, and it kind of places those characters in a country that is also on the precipice of dramatic change. And in that way, I love that the kind of this tiny story in this 2-bedroom apartment kind of blasts out into the larger context of the world.
Which leads me to the idea of the storm that is brewing outside. The genesis of that, is that something that Darren wanted to do?
It was all Darren. Yeah. It was really amazing to see him and Maddie come up with these things. I mean, he always wanted the story to feel kind of mythical and Melvillian. But yeah, and then it wasn't until, because we basically shot the movie in sequence. I mean, there were little pickups here and there, but we basically, told the story over 3 months. And so we shot those last scenes toward the end of a very arduous production process, And I just remember, and like, it was my first experience of being on set. I was exhausted.
Which is a rare experience, by the way. The fact that you were on set. Yeah. Usually the writer is banned.
Oh yeah, this was like, and we also had 3 weeks of rehearsal beforehand that I got to be there for. I mean, this is never going to happen to me again. And this was incredible. And like the level of like collaboration that Darren and Brendan and all the actors wanted from me, I'm incredibly grateful for it. But it was something when we were filming those last scenes and seeing the way that Maddie was lighting it with, that bright light coming in through the windows and the door when Ellie opens the door, it was just like, oh, this is, I loved it. I thought it was beautiful.
Mm-hmm. I mean, we mentioned the mythical quality of it, and you have the storm and feels like Noah's Ark and all this stuff. He always felt to me like a Christ figure. When I saw it the first time, is that something? I'm not too far off.
You're not far off. I actually, in one of my early notebooks, I wrote that down. I was like, I think Charlie's a Christ figure in this story. Because he's somebody who believes in, grace and forgiveness and redemption. It's funny actually. When I was in Venice, I did a lot of like international press, and we did this roundtable, and there was this Polish reporter, and she was like, "Just so you know, all of the Polish reviews talk about how the film is very Christian." And I was like, oh, and Darren was like shocked. and I was like, I love that actually, because like these core principles of Christianity, I had a lot of experiences with, I grew up in Idaho where Charlie is from. I'm gay. I had to leave a religious school after I was outed. So I know the pull of that religion because I tried my best for a long time to be that kind of Thomas, that kind of Christian. And I think like I had a very complicated relationship with it, obviously, for many years, which for me resulted in depression and self-medicating with food. But I think I'm 41 now, and I think I can like look back on that time with a little more clarity and take the good things from it that I could take, and I think those are kind of like present in Charlie.
Which leads to my next question, which you balance hope and despair in the script and the story. Was that something that was challenging for you to keep the hope amidst all the...
Yeah, I mean, I think that's kind of the dramatic tension of the whole piece, right? Is sort of like, how do we hope amidst all the despair? And I think that hope has value when you're drawing it out of the despair. I also think that one of the amazing things, the first thing I said after Darren, had the idea for Brendan, and then we rented a theater and did a reading of it as one would do a reading of the play. We did a reading of the screenplay, and Brendan did it and was astonishing. And the first thing I said to Darren is like, he has the ability to hold deep hope and deep despair at the same time. And that's exactly what this character is.
And you've used the word optimism, and I mentioned to you that the original actor, brilliant, Schuler, he was brooding. Brendan seems to retain that optimism in him,
Yeah, I think so. I think there's also there's something about like Brendan as a human being. He's such a kind-hearted, gentle guy that I think he just really keyed into that with this character very effortlessly. And then I think there's also just a quality to doing it on film that you can get so close and you can see such nuance that, if you have an actor of Brendan's skill level, there's just so much that you can communicate with your eyes.
Yeah.
And Brendan sure does, Whereas like the play version, which I will always love, and Schuler Hensley did in New York and was a revelation. But you kind of have to give it to a big room. You know what I mean? You can't give it to this. So maybe that forces you to be a little bit more assertive or something.
And what was it like for you to be sitting on set, watching Brendan creating your Charlie?
I mean, it was amazing. I kind of just had to keep my nose down and be like, I'm here to help. Because the more that I thought about it, the more that I got like overwhelmed by, I've done a lot of plays at this point, but this is like a level, even though this is a very small movie and it was not an expensive movie, but for me, this is like a level of production that I've never seen before. It was also like the first thing that I did coming out of the pandemic. So this was like, I think we started rehearsals in February of 2021. We were upstate in this town called Newburgh, which is like an hour and a half north of the city, in like a warehouse in the back of a motorcycle museum. So it was all like very surreal. Every part of it was very surreal. So I just really had to be like, I'm here to help. I'm here to help. Like make sure we get the takes. Be of service to anybody who needs it. And I was, and in a lot of different levels. Like I talked a lot to like set dressers about like at one point in the rain sequences, the costume designer had people coming in with umbrellas, and I was like, people in Idaho don't really use umbrellas. And they were like, oh, I mean, so like little nuances like that that help to like fill out the world.
In the original play, the kid is a Mormon.
Yes.
And why shift it?
That was an early shift. I think, at the time it was a little practical. It was Darren's suggestion of like, I think because when I wrote the play, this was pre-Book of Mormon, the musical. It was pre-Mitt Romney. Like, Mormonism still had this kind of mystery about it that, like, now just doesn't exist anymore. Like, it's really just commonplace, I think. But I think the more meaningful shift was that I think I probably made the kid Mormon in a bit of an act of self-protection, because I didn't grow up Mormon. I grew up in a school that was much more similar to where Thomas is coming from. So maybe back in 2009, I made him Mormon to kind of like shield myself a little bit from that. So it was actually kind of cathartic to like write it as something that felt more true to my own experience.
And then you've taught expository writing at Rutgers University, and I couldn't help but notice all throughout the movie, the ideas of expository writing are part of the DNA, not only of the character, but also the journey. And he tells people, you know, write the truth. And that's actually what he's seeking. You know, can you tell us about latching onto that?
Yeah, really. When I started writing this play, I the only thing I knew about it is that the guy was an expository writing teacher. Really, the genesis of the play was I was, as you said, I was teaching at Rutgers, and I, like Charlie, was like desperately trying to connect to my students because it was this like state requirement that they take this course. There was just like so many kids who didn't want to be there, so frustrated. It was really rigorous. I had very little breathing room in the syllabus that I was given by the department. You know, it was really tough to teach, but it paid better than like teaching Theater 101 to the Fordham football team, which I did a lot of too. But at a certain point, and it was also like hard because it felt like anathema to my work as a playwright to be like, take yourself out of it, be objective, don't give opinion, you know what I mean? But the thing that I could really latch onto is a sense of like, say something truthful. And so at a certain point, I got kind of desperate with these kids who were mostly just like summarizing Wikipedia. And I was like, please just like write me something honest. It doesn't need to be good. Like, don't start with the thesis stuff. Don't start with the paragraph structure, or, you know, don't start with that stuff. Like, start with just something you actually believe. And I got a student who wrote me a line that ended up in the play and the movie, which was,
I think I need to accept that my life isn't going to be very exciting.
That's right, yeah. One of my students wrote me that. And it was this bracing moment of honesty. And that, from there, I was like, I want to write a play about an expository writing teacher, which is kind of a weird, you know, place to start. But then, you know, once I started putting more, and I actually started writing a play that bears no resemblance to this, about a writing teacher and a student. And I got about like 25 pages in, and I was just like, this is too heady. I don't know what this is about. I don't know why I'm writing this. And so I kind of had to go back to like, you know, that idea of writing something honest. And for me, that was like accessing things about my past that I had not yet accessed before. Not in an autobiographical way, but in a more sort of like autofiction way, I guess.
Yeah. So take us to Venice, where the film premieres, and you're sitting in the theater seeing the film with a crowd for the first time. How was it?
It was bonkers. I mean, you know, doing a play, which is something I've gotten very used to over the years, you know, 15 plays in or whatever it is, like it's a very collaborative process, and you start bringing people into the room pretty early on. I mean, you know, you'll do a first run through for the designers, you'll do, you know, run throughs for the theater employees, and then you'll start inviting people in to like see the final dress, and then you'll have, you know, if you're lucky, a 2 or 3 week preview process where you're seeing audiences see it every night, and you're making changes and you're honing it. This was such a different experience because I had seen the film 2 times before Venice. I saw a rough cut that had a temporary score very early on with one other person in the room, an employee from A24, and then I saw it after the score got put in. I saw it in an equally small room with my husband and Robert, one of the production designers. And then the next time I saw it was in Venice with 1,100 people and Italian subtitles, and that I was like, is that a decent translation? You know, and sometimes I don't know a lot of Italian, but sometimes I'd be like, that is not what that line is. And I was also like worried because one of my things throughout this entire process was like, we cannot lose the humor. That is the death knell for this thing. If we lose the humor, we absolutely can't. And Darren is, you know, one of the greatest directors out there. Not the funniest guy, you know, like he's not known for his comedy. But to his credit, you know, he had faith in that and it retained it. And yeah, I mean, just, you know, you're watching it and the humor's translating kind of, but a lot of the language-based humor is just not translating at all. And you're like, I think this is going okay. And it was so hot. I was sweating through my tuxedo. But then it got a really great response. And it was like, oh, thank God. But yeah, that was a surreal and stressful evening.
There'll be plenty more like that. You're so talented, and I'm so glad you're here. Thank you
so
for
much.
coming.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you, everybody.